We're going back to the super high roller bowl. This was a fun hand. We'll pick up the action right away where it's me with 12 and 24 blinds. I make it 5,500 from the cutoff with King 10 offsuit. That's pretty standard. You know, you gotta attack these blinds, right? You gotta go for it. Ben Lamb on the button calls with Ace-5 of clubs. Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you could make a case for 3-betting that, but having Ace-5 of clubs in the range of hands you call with is probably a good thing. In the small blind, Pratyush Budiga decides to call with Jack 10 off. A little thin, you know. Ace-5 of clubs in position, sure. Jack 10, he's got, you know, a quarter of the bet in there essentially. It's a little on the closer side because now you're going to play the hand out of position against two pretty good players, if I do say so myself. So we got three of us to the flop, and the flop comes Jack 5-3 rainbow. Pratyush checks, and I look at this flop and think it's a good flop for the raise, right? Unless my opponents have some sort of combination of a Jack 10, Jack 9, Jack Queen, Jack Ace, or a pocket pair like 9s or 8s, which, you know, that's still a touchy-feely kind of situation for them. Or if they flop the set. If they don't have any of those hands, chances are that I'll be able to just pick it up with a continuation bet on the flop, because I'm the one that could have the aces, the kings, the ace-jack, and stuff like that. So I decided to bet 11,000, which is a pretty hefty size, a little like 2/3 of the flop, two-thirds of the pot, I think, in that spot. And that's a lot higher than you would expect to see from most players today. Most players are making much smaller. I tend to throw in some larger ones with hands, without hands, depending. And I felt like one of the things of value that this does for me is that it helps me narrow down the types of hands that my opponents are going to call with, right? So when you make a bet size that big, it's unlikely that they're just going to call you to try to bluff you with something like Queen 10 suited and just have a backdoor straight or flush draw. Probably just going to give those up, right? And that way I can win the pot on the flop with just the King 9. So to my dismay, Ben Lamb calls the button. So I'm pretty much done at this point when Ben calls. I'm like, okay, let's move on to the next hand. And now Pratyush calls in the small blind. Okay. Now Pratyush has to be very aware here. When he calls, his hand is mostly face up. Okay. We know what he doesn't have. He doesn't have nothing. Very, very often. Very unlikely. He doesn't have a hand like King 9, 8, 9, or Ace King. That's for sure. Well, maybe Ace King. Small piece, but really not realistic because he probably 3-bets it from the small blind. So he probably has a Jack. Right? Maybe Jack 10, Jack Queen, something like he does have. Or maybe he's got a set some of the time where he has pocket 5s or pocket 3s. That's his whole range, right? And it's very difficult for him to represent much else other than that. That's going to be relevant on the river. The turn card's a 10, and Pratyush checks, and I'm done with this hand. I know Pratyush has got me beat. I might have Ben beat, because Ben could have something like 7s or 8s and decided to call the flop, you know, thinking it's good a lot of the time, because I'm going to bet most flops. And he decides to check back. I'm like, cool. All right, maybe I'll catch a 10. Whee! Maybe I'll catch a king and win. I don't know. Well, the river's a queen, so I didn't catch nothing. But now, peculiar bet here. 27K from Pratyush. And now I'm thinking to myself, as was Nick Schulman, as you hear right here.
Does Pratyush have much ace-king? Ali just calling on the flop after Daniel bet and Ben called.
No way.
Daniel has ace-king sometimes. Pratyush very rarely has it. I like shooting this up to like real big.
Give it the habanero special?
Yeah, maybe like $1.15. Having that blocker and having a range advantage on the river here.
I think Daniel agrees with you, my friend. That looked like a raise to me.
I really like it because Pratyush has very little ace-king. Daniel has all the ace-king.
Nick Schulman saw the play. I seized on it, though. Okay? Nick saw it, and he talked about it in the commentary booth, like, oh yeah, check me out, I'm Nick Schulman, I can be in the commentary booth and say, you know, what they should be doing. But I did it, okay? I decided that this guy's range is capped. He doesn't have ace-king, ever. He doesn't have king 9, ever. He doesn't have 8-9, ever. But I could have any of those hands, right? With any of those hands, it's reasonable that I would bet that flop, get a turn, and then go, boink! I made it straight on the river. So the hand sets up well for me to turn this into a bluff. Obviously, I know the 10s are no good. I do have one king in my hand, which is a blocker that makes it slightly less likely, but it's not even a concern because when the hell does Pratyush really have a straight here or a hand strong enough to call? He might have a set, and if he has a set, maybe he calls me here because he could beat queens and jacks or queens and tens. So with a set, he might call. It's a remote possibility. Most likely, what I put him on when he bet the turn was a jack, a pair of jacks that he's now turning it, made two pair with or something along those lines. Maybe queens and jacks. Ben folds. Pertush thinks for quite a while, and he lays down the hand. Now this was Pertush's pot to lose, and he found a way to do it. And this is one of the things I want you guys to be worried about, and it's a tip to think about, is when you open the door for disaster. I wrote a column about it many years ago against Sammy Farha in the World Series of Poker, where I did exactly that, where I raised them in a spot where I could have just called, or I, bet in a spot where I could have check called. Pertush has to be aware in this spot that he can't represent the nuts, but other people might. We all know he doesn't have it. So whenever you're in a situation like that, you have to decide, if you're betting, are you going to call the raise against the good player who's capable of pulling the trigger on a bluff? And if you're not willing to make the call, then you got to make the check. Because what's he getting called by, right? We all know he's got at least the jack when he calls the flop, right? So the turn is a connected card. It's a 10. The river's another connected card. It's a queen. That's a whole bunch of connected cards. If he bets the river, we all go, yeah. Well, looks like he's got two pair. It wasn't a surprise. When your hands face up, you shouldn't really be betting.